Crossing over bridges, playful teenagers commute to and from school. A grandfather carries a grandchild on his shoulders. A helicopter circles overhead nearby mountains and dry riverbeds. The smell of car exhaust looms at a checkpoint. A street at 100+ degree temperature sizzles. What kinds of images come to your mind when I mention the US-Mexico border? Where did these images come from? Personal experience? How about a movie you may have seen? Or maybe you know little to nothing at all. Latina representation, also known as Latino, Latina, Latinx, is severely lacking in the media. But according to the UCLA Film Diversity Report, of 6% of film directors were Latina for theatrical films. 7% were for streaming. And for queer representation, it's also severely lacking. Of 26,000 speaking roles across 600 films, 45 were gay, 10 were lesbian, 3 were bisexual, and 3 were trans. But here's the thing, here's the truth. Audiences are actually craving diversity. Series like Wednesday, starring Mexican and Puerto Rican actor Jenna Ortega, and The Last of Us Chilean actor starring Pedro Pascal, were way up. So we're seeing that viewership actually increases when people are allowed to tell their stories and when the cast is more inclusive of people of color. But excitement aside for that, Latina representation is still crawling at a very slow pace. For example, how many of us actually get a chance to drive? How many Latina films are actually funded and resourced properly? Well, directing-wise, according to the same study, there were only 5% of Latina directors for theatrical films and 6% for streaming. So it's still very, very low. But for writers, it was even less. For theatrical films, Latina writers and directors were women were hardly existent. At the same time, there are changes that are being made, but we're also severely under budgeted. So amongst theatrical films, the budgets tended to be lower for Latina and for people of color. And for theatrical films, the same thing tended to happen with lower budgets for BIPOC. So why is it actually so important that Latina people tell their own stories? Well, first of all, we're almost 20% of the population. Secondly, there are so many inaccuracies still about our people. Most of these inaccuracies have to do with seeing our people as being violent or immigrants coming over to take your jobs. And the inaccuracies don't stop there with Latina people. They actually affect so many others. They affect trans communities, the disabled community, the undocumented community, and the queer community. So where do we go from here? Well, with the amount of slow changes that there are, for example, audiences craving diversity, but there are so many problems with these inconsistencies. So for example, for someone like me, what kind of story would you tell yourself about me if you knew nothing? Well, I was born in El Paso, Texas, in a predominantly Mexican and Mexican-American community. And I grew up as a very quiet kid. But growing up in my community, I never experienced racism personally. However, in 1999, I moved to San Francisco and went to the University of San Francisco, and I did experience some discrimination. For the first time, I got to feel what it was like to be noticed for my ethnicity. For the first time, I felt what it was like to have brown skin. And as a quiet kid, my primary method of speaking up for myself, of sharing my own stories, was through art. First, it was when I was a teenager, through music. And then I took one film class at the University of San Francisco. and absolutely fell in love. For me, filmmaking was a powerful, moving, fascinating way to tell stories. And for the next several years after that, I got to work in documentary filmmaking with a social justice lens for the next 12 years. But I missed home as much as I had grown to love and to be nurtured in a very beautiful arts and film community. So in 2011, my husband and I we had a family in El Paso. But the images that I was seeing coming up about El Paso around that time, around 2016, they weren't the images that I had come to remember or love. These images were filled with tent cities popping up, asylum seekers being turned away. The walls that were being built around my community were growing taller. The demonization and the dehumanization of immigrants was increasing. And those who would come into our community to harm and instill hatred and violence toward immigrants was also increasing. So what the other portion of that, very, very problematic portion of that is that when the news and TV and media were reporting on the stories in our community, they weren't stories that were coming from us. They were often one-sided, oversimplified versions. And so in 2016, I, along with 5 other filmmakers from the US-Mexico border, from El Paso, Texas, Las Cruces, New Mexico, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, decided to tell perspectives from us. We decided to share films that were from each of our respective homelands and share our own perspectives. And that became the Femme Frontera Filmmaker Showcase, a one-time event celebrating filmmakers from the US-Mexico border. Or so we thought it would be, a one-time event. We ended up expanding from a single event into an organization whose mission it is to champion and loudly and proudly amplify films from people who live, work, and love in our border region. And so we were very fortunate to be able to do that, because at the end of the day, we realize that the films that we create, the stories that we're telling, need to be told by us, by those of us who are living those experiences. And Femme Frontera is actually a little of the actual everyone. We make sure that women, non-binary, and queer folks of color are the ones being put at front and center. It is very difficult, as you can see, to speak in front of a large audience, sharing your truth, challenging different perspectives. But we all know that it's one of the most important things that all of us can do. I'm going to share now a bit of the experiences that my colleagues have shared on what it's like to cross the US-Mexico border. Crossing over bridges, playful teenagers commute to and from school. Grandparents and parents with their children enter through the Mexican side, all while military personnel check personal belongings on both sides of the bridge. There are no nights when we don't sleep under the sound of helicopters and spotlights shining down on our rooftops as federal agencies circle our mountains and dry river, looking for humans moving over the desert in the night toward safety. If you don't have family on both sides of the border, you probably don't know what it's like to FaceTime with someone who's a 15-minute walk away, or what it was like before FaceTime. Do you get to cherish memories of family parties in Ciudad Juarez? Theo's playing music, Thea singing, food and the sound of cousins running wild and free filling the air. The sky gradually changing, transforming from blue to radiant gold with a view of the mountains in El Paso, your other home in the distance. Do you know what it's like to live on the Mexican side of the river where, in some cases, you can only have that one home? Whatever your background, it's essential to consider the complexity and the diversity of the people and places that make up the US-Mexico border. If you weren't born here and if you're not from here, wouldn't it make a little more sense to listen a little bit more carefully, more intently to those who have? Thank you. One story at a time. Thank you.